Thank you for joining this National Reconciliation Week conversation about a project that addresses the shared history of the Indigenous peoples of Australia and the University of Melbourne. I'm Margot Eden, Associate Director, Indigenous Strategy, and I'm privileged to be involved in this important work and very pleased to introduce this event. I begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, Bunurong, Yorta Yorta and Dja Dja Wurrung peoples as the traditional owners of the lands on which the university's campuses are located and whose sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respects to their elders and their culture, and I extend that respect to Indigenous viewers. I also acknowledge the traditional owners, elders and respected persons of other nations and clans with whom the university has a long-standing relationship and who have been instrumental in our reconciliation journey. As a community of researchers, staff and students, we are fortunate to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues who are generous in providing their knowledge, experience, leadership and support. For some years now, the university has been engaged in initiatives to improve the lived experience of the university's Indigenous community by working with traditional owners, elders and Indigenous organisations to enhance the profile of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures across our campuses, to create opportunities for staff and students to gain an understanding of the contemporary, historical and traditional cultures, values and knowledges of Indigenous Australians and the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and to ensure our university is a culturally safe, welcoming and respectful learning and working environment for Indigenous students and staff and the wider Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. The university's Elevate Reconciliation Action Plan, or RAP, has targets around Indigenous cultural recognition and promoting critical and scholarly engagement with the university's history and our historical relationships with Indigenous Australians. A 2019 research colloquium on place and Indigenous cultural recognition addressed the relevant historical and policy contexts, highlighted the nuances required to meaningfully recognise Indigenous culture and heritage within the university, and elucidated the complexities in naming and renaming spaces on our campuses. At this event, Uncle Jim Berg, a Gunditjmara elder and member of the steering committee for this project, delivered a powerful keynote address and challenged the university to engage more deeply in its history and in a process of truth-telling. The colloquium resulted in an acknowledgement that the university's histories are contested and that we needed to formally acknowledge our institutional and colonial past and our complicity with respect to eugenics and scientific racism, and to establish mechanisms to appropriately reflect Indigenous culture and heritage, including within the built and landscape environment. And it was on this basis, and in order to support the university's Advancing Melbourne strategy and meet our Elevate RAP commitments with respect to place, that the university agreed on the need to first commission a research project to properly articulate that contested history. And this work commenced in January 2021. This project, which is Indigenous-led, will have a range of outputs, providing material for taught subjects, podcast series, symposia, signage for buildings named after controversial figures, and for the university's cultural awareness training. The first output, however, will be a book that will provide an intellectual baseline and mechanism to locate the University of Melbourne in the broader global movement around cultural recognition in the tertiary sector, where there has been considerable student activity aimed at dismantling the vestiges of violent, racist and problematic histories at universities. We believe it will be of considerable academic value with the capacity to greatly influence curricula. Over the last 16 months, interest in the project has resulted in more than 65 contributors agreeing to provide content for the book, and the material is as rich and diverse as it is both uplifting and often disturbing. And the following conversation will touch upon some of this material. Professor Barry Judd will lead the discussion with Dr. Ross Jones and Dr. James Waghorn, historians who, together with Associate Provost Professor Marcia Langton, are editors of the book to be published early next year. Joining them is Professor Zoe Laidlaw, a contributor to the book. Professor Barry Judd is Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous and Director of the Indigenous Studies Program in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. In his role as Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Professor Judd has responsibility for institutional policy, strategy and advice in relation to all aspects of Indigenous higher education. As Director of Indigenous Studies, he provides academic leadership to the program through undergraduate teaching, research higher degree supervisions, and research activity in support of this growing field of studies. Professor Judd is a member of the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. He was also a Foundation Chief Investigator of the National Indigenous Research and Knowledges Network and a Foundation Editor of Aboriginal Journal of Indigenous Studies and First Nations and First Peoples Cultures. His area of research expertise relates to Australian race relations in Australian sports and interdisciplinary research methods in Indigenous studies and Australian history. Professor Judd has worked in support of Indigenous activity in Australian higher education for over 30 years in both professional staff and academic roles. He is widely published and holds several current Australian Research Council grants. Professor Zoe Laidlaw joined the University of Melbourne as Professor of History in 2018, returning to Australia after 2 decades studying and working in the United Kingdom. An historian of British imperialism and colonialism, Professor Laidlaw has published widely. Her current research focuses on the Australasian legacies of British slave ownership and on the European invasion of the Port Phillip district. Dr. Ross Jones is the Senior Research Fellow in the Indigenous History of the University of Melbourne project in the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education. After teaching the histories of biology and medicine in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Melbourne, he took up an Australian Research Council postdoctoral position in the History School at the University of Sydney. In 2016-17, he was awarded the Redmond Barry Fellowship at the State Library of Victoria to write on the history of tuberculosis. Dr. Jones' research interests and publications range across medical and educational eugenics in Australia and the US and UK, the history of human anatomy, anthropology and race theory, the development of public education, medical biography and public health policies. Dr. James Waghorn coordinates the History of Universities program in the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the university. He has published on the role of students in shaping university cultures and on the relationship between universities and professional associations, as well as on lobby groups and professional and community organisations. Dr. Waghorn is an investigator on the Expert Nation and universities and post-war recovery research projects, tracing the careers of university graduates who served in the First and Second World Wars, funded by the Australian Research Council. The 2022 National Reconciliation theme builds upon last year's theme, which encouraged us all to engage in more impactful action towards reconciliation. This year's theme, Be Brave, Make Change, now asks us to boldly step up to do so. And we're working hard to make change. In 2021, the university issued an apology to Indigenous Australians, acknowledging that, since its foundation in 1853, our shared history with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people has been tainted by colonisation and institutional racism, and committing to actions to right historical wrongs to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this country. This project, about which you'll now hear, is an important example of this commitment, a commitment to engage in a deep and honest assessment of the issues that have resulted in the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples being disregarded, diminished or denied. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Margot, for that wonderful introduction and acknowledgement to country. My first question is directed to James, and it's a long one and a complex one. One of the key aspects of this work is to understand the university's place, both in terms of its location and its history. When we talk about the university's history, we often highlight figures of prominence, the great researchers, donors, and fine teachers. This Indigenous History Project sounds a note of caution about this, and that more work is needed to fully appreciate all the dimensions in a person's career. James, this is a worldwide phenomenon over recent years. What are the key moments, and how do we connect these global movements and issues to Melbourne?
Well, thanks, Barry. It is a difficult question, but it is a really interesting one, actually. One of the reasons this Indigenous History Project is so pressing at the moment is that this is something that universities across the world actually are grappling with. There's been a recent shift, really, actually, in the last sort of 10 years around universities, where there's a growing appreciation that they must do more to recognise the difficult and problematic aspects of their histories. But it's an interesting moment for universities because it's about how they represent themselves in the community, and it's about how their community experiences the university, and particularly how they understand and interpret different figures and see different perspectives on the great and the good in universities past. So if we think internationally, I think there are three main strands. The first of them has to do with slavery and legacies of slavery. This has been really prominent in the United States, particularly informed by Craig Stephen Wilder's Ebony and Ivy, a really important book in this area, that highlighted the connections between lots of universities in the United States and slavery, led to all sorts of campaigns, led to universities actually across the United States to appoint committees to investigate their history and to understand how those connections have played out. There have been calls from things like renaming Yale University because of its namesake's career as a slave trader. Perhaps the most notable example of this is the decision of Princeton University to rename its Institute of International Affairs and to remove the name of Woodrow Wilson, former President of the United States, because of his past work in his segregationist policies. So slavery is a really critical one. A second one has to do with colonisation, and perhaps that has the most resonance with the University of Melbourne's project. And this is perhaps most notable in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, started at the University of Cape Town, that highlighted the symbolisation of Cecil Rhodes and what he symbolised in terms of colonisation, and how a statue on that campus was interpreted by the student body as a symbolisation of colonisation, and of also the legacy of that, in the dreadful legacy of that in South Africa. And the University of Cape Town removed that statue, but it also has obviously been picked up right around the former Commonwealth countries, including the UK and even Australia. So colonisation and decolonisation is a really critical theme. The third strand has to do with eugenics, which Ross, I'm sure, is going to talk about more today. And we've seen universities, particularly in the UK there, grapple with this. And, for example, University College London has removed the name of Sir Francis Galton, the founder of eugenics, from its university lecture theatre, among others. So we've seen this kind of change at universities, but as our project and our work on this project has shown, these campaigns have actually been going for decades, right back to even the 1970s. But we've seen in recent years more recognition from universities that they need to understand and acknowledge this history. They need to look again at who they're naming their buildings after, at what their own involvement as an institution has been in some of these aspects of their history, not only to ensure the cultural safety and to support the students who are living and want to identify with their institution, but also to inform their work going forward and to acknowledge the ethical fissures that their work often creates. The difficult histories are not just in the past, they also should inform future practice. So how does that relate to this is actually the context in which the university's project is started. And at this university, we've had our own story, haven't we, with the renaming of the Richard Berry building.
Yeah.
That's right, which Ross was essentially involved in over the last sort of 10 years.
Not the renaming, but certainly raising issues. And I think there are lots of questions about how that building was renamed that need answering in this project, which we might get to that later.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
Thank you, James. My next question is directed to Zoe. Zoe, you have a chapter on pastoral endowments of the university. How does the settler colonial economy support the university, and what are the impacts today?
Thanks, Barry. Well, the university's largest and most important donors in the 19th century, so from its foundation in the 1850s through to the end of the 19th century, are pastoralists. And they derive their vast fortunes from pastoral activities, particularly in the Western District of Victoria. Almost all of the big donors to the early university are Western District pastoralists. They provide the funding for some of the university's best known buildings, the original Wilson Hall, for example, Ormond College, one of the first residential colleges. They endow chairs. So Ormond also endowed the university's chair of music. It's still the Ormond Chair of Music today. And they also provide the basis for scholarships and exhibitions. So still, I think every year 6 Wyselaski scholarships are awarded, including one in my own discipline, in history, but also in mathematics, various branches of science, I think politics as well. And they're very lucrative scholarships, very important. So here we are 150 years or so after the benefactors died, and we're still supporting our graduate students with scholarships like that. So those pastoralists, their names are still with us. The benefits from their donations and bequests are still very much part of the fabric of the university today. So I think the ways in which their gifts continue to support the university and its community are really apparent. But it's important as well to think about what that money enabled the early university, when it was a much smaller and rather faltering institution, what those gifts allowed it to do in the 19th century. I mean, if we think back to the early 1870s, for example, there were a few of the university's buildings had been put up. So I think the old quad is there, but there was no hall for the university. And the Chancellor of the university and the council felt very strongly that if Melbourne was going to be an international institution, a university worthy of its name, it needed what they termed a hall of suitable dignity to conduct its ceremonies in. And they felt this really deeply. They saw that as just as important as having a fine array of faculty and that their students qualified with good degrees. So they asked the colonial government if they could have money to build a hall, and the colonial government turned them down. And they next approached a man called Samuel Wilson, who owned an absolutely vast estate in the Western District, or just to the northwest of Ballarat at that stage. Ercildoune was called. And he, so the story goes, laid down £30,000 to build Wilson Hall almost immediately. This was at the end of 1874. In fact, he was able to transfer the money to the university so quickly that by the time the hall was built and named after him and opened, that money had already accrued another £7,000 of interest. So in those kinds of ways, the university could turn to private philanthropists to appeal for money to, create chairs, build buildings, support its students in ways that continue to resonate today. when I've got a quote here that, you know, Wilson, when Wilson Hall was opened in 1879, made some remarks on that occasion, which I think give you a sense of how the sort of status they felt that these donations were bestowing on the university. So Wilson said, he reflected in his remarks that Wilson Hall would make Melbourne the Athens of Australia and the Oxford of the Southern Hemisphere. So we're talking about very important contribution to the university. What is typically has been left out of those accounts is how those fortunes were made. And those fortunes, as I said, they were derived from settler colonialism, from pastoralism in the Western District, and they were all made on the unceded lands of the Aboriginal peoples of Victoria. And all those benefactors I mentioned, Samuel Wilson, Francis Ormond, John Dixon Wise-Lasky, John Hastie, in whose name scholarships are still awarded today, they were amongst the earliest pastoralists, the earliest settler colonisers to arrive in Victoria, and they were part of the very violent expropriation of land. They dispossessed Aboriginal peoples across what was then the Port Phillip district and then became Victoria. And they went on to then exploit Aboriginal labour as well. So they didn't just dispossess, they weren't just involved in murderous violence, they exploited Aboriginal labour later on, and then they were part of a culture of forgetting, of obscuring what had gone on, which is still with us today. And that's why we remember these, very beneficent donors, but we don't talk enough about at whose expense they acquired those fortunes.
Zoe, reading your chapter, I was quite shocked at your comment about that Victoria was really an outlier in terms of the destruction of the Indigenous population. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ross. And I think whilst most non-Indigenous Victorians today are aware of the violence of that early colonial frontier, and the Port Phillip district, the first European settler colonisers arrived kind of about 1835 with John Batman and so on. So Victorians are aware that there was a violent process of dispossession, but in that first 15 or 16 years, the speed with which settler colonisers moved across, particularly to the west and northwest of Melbourne, and took that land and engaged in really violent interactions with the Aboriginal peoples there, it made Victoria, the speed and the depth of the devastation made Victoria an outlier, even against a global backdrop of very violent European imperialism. So of course Aboriginal peoples survived and endured, but the damage done to the numbers of the population, to the demography, was really substantial. And there were no, in other parts of Britain's empire even, there were inadequate treaties made. There were treaties though, in Victoria that didn't occur. So the story here in Victoria is actually one that stands out for its devastating nature.
Thank you. Very compelling story. What about the work of the university itself? How was race science important in Melbourne, Ross?
I think one eminent historian said to me, it'd be a strange university in the 19th and earlier 20th century that didn't teach race science. So Melbourne was certainly, race science was imbued in many different aspects of the University of Melbourne. It gained a real fillip from Darwin's publications, and evolution was around before then, but it really turbocharged the notions of evolution, and then people took on the idea of the survival of the fittest, which and social Darwinism, which meant, of course, that there were inferior and superior people, and it was a scientific fact that they were not going to survive. And Indigenous people, and so there were scales of success, and of course the white Anglo-Saxon male was at the top. And many writers would say that Australian Aboriginals were right down to the bottom according to this scale of race science. So Darwinism came quite fast to Melbourne because it was sort of developed about the same time, and there's been a lot written about how Melbourne embraced Darwinism, and Melbourne University, after initially not being more creationist. But a good example of which we might talk about later is Anketel Henderson, who was of racism that sort of stands outside eugenics and a racism that sort of goes back right into the 19th century. And he was of the 19th and early 20th century. He's celebrated on the website of the architecture department as the first architectural graduate of the university. And he set up a very successful business in Melbourne and got the commissions for most of the older buildings we see around the university. So Elizabeth Murdoch, which is old pathology, University House, which was once a professor's house. I think there are others. There's a lot of them. People will know them. They're the grand Gothic piles. Biology, which is now called Ball and Spencer. You can walk around and see them. And Henderson's name's on a lot of the signposts of the university. Well, James did a bit of detective work. We discovered that Henderson went around lecturing to the students, and it's in all the old student journals, and also travelled the state in Ballarat, Bendigo, gave public lectures saying that the most important factor in architecture was race. And because architecture proved the superiority of the white race, and that the buildings he built were meant to show how superior white races were to the dark races. So there we have buildings standing in the university epitomising race science. But then, of course, Richard Berry arrived, the professor of anatomy in 1906, and he was a very volatile, very public-orientated, a good public speaker, very keen to make an impact. And he spread the eugenic message right through, I think a lot of people know, Melbourne and Australia. And he had an enormous influence on education, which I've written about. It's setting up, but one of the things that wasn't very well known is that he was on the university committees with Frank Tate, who was the Director of Education. And they pushed very hard in public fora and on the council to stop the University of Melbourne becoming a fee-free university. Western Australia was, for example, there were examples in Canada and overseas. And he wrote in the Herald and the Age and the Argus saying this is an abomination because eugenics proves that there are superior people and inferior people are living in slums, and inferior people are Indigenous Australians, and inferior people are alcoholics, homosexuals, and that they shouldn't be allowed to go to university. And he had a lot of influence, and that came out in the magazines they sent to teachers teaching in state schools, academic articles out of the graduate school here showing how kids in slums shouldn't be allowed to go to universities. These were written by Chris McRae, who became the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney. He was one of Australia's first psychologists, and he was a protege of Frank Tate. So you've got, and then of course the Eugenic Society of Victoria in 1936, set up with Professor Agar, who was Professor of Dean of the Science Faculty here. He was Chairman of the Society. It was full of Melbourne University academics. They proposed sterilisation of working class people and Indigenous people. And they carried on right through to the 1960s. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that race science is imbued right through different disciplines, through different levels, and you find it in different places, in buildings and in ideas, and in the future that a lot of school children had or didn't have.
And I think what you're talking about there, Ross, is how this is so central to the university's work and its public role, that it's not marginal work, actually, that it applies right the way across the university. It's not the work of individuals necessarily, but it's applied around the university in different ways with different consequences. And I think that's what we're talking about here when we talk about the need to acknowledge this in terms of it informing our current and future work, is that if you portray eugenics and race science as the concern of some geneticists who are...
Or a few right-wing nutters. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Then you don't quite capture how significant it was and how pervasive it was.
And what impact, enormous impact it had on people, people who couldn't go to university because race science said they weren't able to.
So very much like what Zoe was saying with the dependence on the settler colonial economy, we have these underlying influences running through the university, which we really do need to acknowledge if we're to understand universities and their place in Victoria. So this is what, I think this is the significant shift that we've seen over recent decades actually around the world. So it's as Ross said, it's not about just singling out the kind of nutters and portraying them as outliers, but really understanding how their work is influential over right across the universities in the Western world, actually. So, yeah.
You mentioned the Baldwin Spencer building. Just as a side, when I was a very young person, my working life started at the University of Melbourne, and I was part of a Aboriginal cadetship scheme, as it was called then. And so invisible were the things you've just outlined that the university thought it was a good idea to place myself and several other Aboriginal cadets in the Baldwin Spencer building as young people. So
there's a sign outside the Baldwin Spencer building celebrating Anketel Henderson, who built it, who said that, whites were, this building shows that whites are better than blacks, and Baldwin Spencer, who was, we'll talk about Baldwin Spencer later, he's an interesting case, but he was certainly going to be the president of the first Eugenics Society of Victoria in 1914, which fell over because of the First World War.
Yeah, so we should introduce Baldwin Spencer actually and explain who he was. He was obviously a really towering figure in the early university, professor of biology at the university. Came to the university as this great esteemed figure. And is he Oxford or Cambridge?
Oxford, I think.
Yeah.
He worked at the Pitt Rivers Museum, I believe.
Yeah. So he brings that Oxford credential, which is actually relatively rare among the other university staff at that time. So he has this enormous authority, but he also has an interest in anthropology, and he makes his trip through the Northern Territory, and he becomes protector of Aborigines in the Northern Territory in 1911-13. When he advocates things like child removal, and he makes all sorts of comments on the intellectual capacity of Aboriginal people and so forth.
But being devil's advocate, as the land rights cases today use the extensive anthropological writings of Baldwin Spencer to document the period. And I know Marcy has talked to me about that quite a lot. And he was president of the VFL, as you'd know, Barry.
He was. I know that fact, and you're quite right, Ross. Marcia and I both work with an Indigenous PhD student from Central Australia, and much of his work it's really about reviving knowledge and ceremony. Relies on the work of Spencer and his colleague Frank Gillen.
Frank Gillen, yeah.
So he's an interesting case, as Ross pointed out, because there are these kinds of layers involved, and we have to really fully understand his legacy and his contribution in ways that perhaps having Baldwin Spencer building on top of the entrance to your office doesn't quite achieve, But maybe we can talk about that a bit further as well.
I always felt uneasy and creeped out in that building, I have to admit. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because of these issues we're talking about today. One of the central ways in which the university has recognised its great names is in the naming of buildings. One of the questions is when we acknowledge an individual in their lifetime or afterwards, when were the buildings named? And this question is to you firstly, James.
Well, I'll make a start, and others might join as well. You have when we started this project, this is something that has interested me, is the question of when these buildings are named. When was the Baldwin Spencer building named? And from my research, I believe the Baldwin Spencer building was named in 1988, when the building you were in, which was an annex off the original biology building, was added. They named it for Baldwin Spencer, who'd been safely dead for at least 50 years at that point, more perhaps. And this is true. This is what we found actually, is that there's a great many. So there are examples like Sir Samuel Wilson's Wilson Hall, named in the 1880s as the building is erected.
1870s, actually.
1870?
Yeah.
My mistake. Named in the 1870s when the building was erected. And they are named after substantial donors and those sorts of things. But beyond that, the university really didn't have a named building around the place. Obviously, Ormond College is named for Ormond. But this changes around the Second World War, when the university wants to acknowledge its history, wants to celebrate its important figures. It names a lecture theatre after Orm Masson, the great professor of chemistry. It names some of the streets after Baldwin Spencer, after Monash. That's right. It starts naming. It renames things like the North Building, which is named the Redmond Barry Building, and has those lecture theatres named after a whole lot of knights, including Alfred Rivette, John Medley.
Both members of the Eugenic Society of Victoria.
But yes, absolutely. And so thereafter you get this series of buildings being renamed after individuals, including the Richard Berry Building.
Which was very late. I always thought he raised the money to build it in the 1920s.
In the 20s,
and so I always assumed it had been named then, but it wasn't. It's after the Second World War. Well, it was into the 70s.
Yeah. So once you realise that this is what the university is doing, it becomes a story about how the university wants to present itself. It's not a kind of acknowledgement perhaps on the death of an individual, or it's less that, of the work that they've given to the university. It's not always an acknowledgement of a great gift to the university. It's an argument actually about what the university stands for, about who should represent it, and that changes things. It allows us to analyse it in a more nuanced way, I think. It becomes a story of heritage policy. And that, I think, it's a mixed question, because I'm a great believer in acknowledging that heritage. And I think there is great value, actually, in showing people the names of individuals who have gone before them, whom they can aspire to achieve as much as perhaps, that shows that this is an institution that is a peopled institution, that universities are made by people rather than necessarily ideas or arid sort of fields of study. But it's also a difficult legacy. Sometimes, particularly when we think about individuals who, like Baldwin Spencer, who have done many great things, like chair the VFL, but also have other aspects of their careers and their legacy that also need to be. I'm not sure whether I'd call it weighed in the balance, but at least acknowledged. And I think that once we start seeing universities as places full of people and made by people, that allows us to it gives us a way of understanding the past and where we're coming from in a richer way, and that perhaps the university has done when it's been naming these buildings and just putting up, the Thomas Labie Theatre without explaining who Thomas Labie was and why the building was named for him and so forth.
So this tradition, it's sounding awfully like the Anzac Day match between Essendon and Collingwood. What you're saying, James, is this tradition in many ways is a recent phenomenon. I'm just wondering whether we could go to Ross now and why have we forgotten how recent the naming of buildings after great academics is at our university?
It shocked us both. James and I were completely surprised that we kept going through buildings named Agar building named in the 1980s.
Early 1980s.
The Agar Theatre, named in the 80s. I think it's the point about James made about heritage. I think the university suddenly got a big sort of burst of we're Melbourne University, because they commissioned Blaney to write the history. This is after the war. And then there's a spate of pieces written about great academics. So there's the great biography, that's in the early 80s by Mulvaney of Baldwin Spencer. But Ken Russell wrote the history of the medical school in this period. There was a sort of celebration of the 100th year, and so they then started to write all these histories, and there were Australian Dictionary of Biography entries, and there was a big project to write about, the great men mainly, and one or two women maybe. The fascinating thing is that they wrote all this stuff out almost completely, or mentioned it briefly in passing. So Ken Russell, who was a professor of anatomy at the University of, at the anatomy in the medical school, died about 30 years ago. I met him when he was an older man. He was taught by Berry and Wood Jones and knew them. He wrote about Berry in his History of the Medical School. He wrote an essay of Berry that was published, and one spot says he had an interest in eugenics. If you go and read Berry's unpublished autobiography in the library, Berry says, the most important thing in my career was eugenics. It's the one thing that I really, that I spent so much of my time teaching. He travelled the country, made one of the very first early moving films, Berry, silent film, that was shown around. I've been trying to find it, I can't find it, about mental deficiency, about the danger of all these inferior people breeding and destroying the white race because of all white Australia and this big racial experiment that they were having that was, distinctly Australian, as we know. The British weren't that interested in it, and others were, people were, but generally speaking. So if you go through and you look at Agar's entries, you look at Berry, you look at Macfarlane Burnet, who's a person, Sir Frank Macfarlane Burnet, the famous Nobel laureate who was here. He was also involved in the eugenics movement in England, particularly. If you go and look at their biographies, Baldwin Spencer, all the people we've named, there's nothing about their racial attitudes. There's nothing about eugenics. There's nothing about Osborne, the professor of physiology, who was a big public figure, was a Nazi supporter in the 1930s. There's nothing about that. It was all wiped. And, in that great lecture, Stanner's great lecture, Boyer lecture, probably the most famous Boyer lecture about the Great Australian Silence, what happened to Indigenous Australia, it disappeared. Historians didn't write about it. And he names Max Crawford and others who, Max gets a better go than some of the others, but who just wrote Indigenous people out of the history of Australia from the early times up until the 1920s, and then it got a little better, but basically to the Second World War. The same thing happened with these people and eugenics. And I don't know we can go over all the possible. Some people say it's one of those unconscious suppressions. It's something that there are things become so familiar, people just suppress it. Is it deliberate suppression?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at here as well, though, is that this is an argument. So even naming Wilson Hall is an argument, even though he donated vast amounts of money, £30,000, to build that. the university didn't initially say it would name the building after him. It only that occurred later, and the University Council had to take a decision about whether to name it after him. That's an argument. It's an argument about what the university represents. It's about trying to acknowledge the great munificent gift and trying perhaps to encourage others to do likewise. It's about an argument about the university's place in society and how it is supported by the great and the good in the community, that it's not some alien body, but it's actually supported by the community. But in that argument, as we're seeing, there are bits that are omitted from that argument, or that argument is only sustained by omitting or overlooking a whole section of an individual's legacy. So you might argue, we'll name this lecture theatre after John Latham because he was a great administrator of the university and a High Court judge and a knight. But that argument about how we're going to acknowledge that story is only to tell part of that story and try to perhaps highlight the great and the good aspects of that story, while overlooking, in this kind of decorous, polite way, anything that might go the other way. And I think that it's important for universities to acknowledge the full story, because actually these figures can, in the main, can sustain having a more nuanced understanding of them. They can, the decision to acknowledge them and their part in the university's history, if we understand it, we can then acknowledge it properly. We can absorb that information, and it complicates our understanding of the institution. But in no way, I think, does it destroy it. But it makes it more mixed, more challenging.
Can I just ask Zoe a question? Sorry to put this without notice. Your main work's on slavery and funding was through slavery and recent work. What's your perception of either the University of Western Australia, which is just an example, or an international, just a brief international perspective on this? How do people deal with this problem, this naming problem, do you think?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of renaming, actually, Ross, and the money that comes out of slavery, and particularly out of the transatlantic slavery, which doesn't end until the 19th century, there's a lot of work that shows how substantial fortunes from that trade and from the plantations and the Caribbean economy and the economy of North America before it became independent feeds back into the British economy and into all sorts of its institutions, I mean, across the board, the Anglican Church, as well as universities and all sorts of institutions. And the older universities have buildings that were endowed by slave traders and by magnates who owned incredible fortunes. And they often, as is the case at Melbourne, it takes a while for individuals who work at the university to be acknowledged through naming practices, but they're much quicker to name buildings after benefactors. So there were names that were absolutely been around for hundreds of years on very grand buildings in Oxford and Cambridge and so on. And now there's a very considerable push to change those names. And sometimes that's happening. Perhaps more often what we're seeing is a kind of middle step, where you have plaques put up that acknowledge the harm that these people did. And in a way, that's what's gone on with Cecil Rhodes, not at the University of Cape Town, but in Oxford, where, of course, he's a huge benefactor of Oriel College, and there's a statue, and it's been extremely controversial about whether that should be removed, about how the college should deal with, that's not you could say actually that some of the people who worked for Rhodes were enslaved, but it's part of the same issue. How do I think it has raised all sorts of questions that extend beyond universities to the heart of the British establishment. and ask people to reassess their understanding of their nation's history. And that's proving, I mean, we can see that in the UK with the controversy surrounding the National Trust, simply trying to put up some interpretative boards in various properties that were also funded through slavery. This has become part of contemporary culture wars. So I don't think that we could look to an international example or an Australian example to see, you know, kind of a case study where this has really worked, that an institution or a society has found their way through this problem. But there's certainly one that's occupying a lot of people and a lot of airspace, I think.
I want to push us along by continuing this conversation perhaps, and recognising that this exercise is a different kind of history project for the university, in that it's confronting and quite disturbing. And some of the conversations I've had with each of you over the email or in person have raised histories that I was previously unaware of and have never stopped thinking about. And I think the standout for me was a discussion around Sunderland and defence policy in the 1950s, which I continue to think about a lot. I'm just wondering whether I can get each of you in turn to provide more detail about the relationship of these figures to race and racism and settler colonialism. So I'd like to start with you, Zoe, on Ormond.
Yeah, okay. Well, Frances Ormond is someone whose name is immediately associated with the University of Melbourne, probably primarily through the residential college, Ormond College, and its magnificent tower that sits at the north of the original university block. But we also have the Ormond Chair of Music. And Ormond is one of, you know, he's characteristic of the early pastoralists who made their fortunes in the Western District of Victoria. He came to the Port Phillip district with his family in 1842. They arrived. He was only a teenager, he was about 13. His father was also called Francis Ormond, and Point Ormond in Melbourne is actually named for his father, not for Francis Ormond, who was the benefactor of the university. So Francis Ormond, who we're interested in, was about 13. He, his sister and his mother and father moved down to the Lee River between Geelong and Hamilton, and there his father built an inn on the Lee River at what is today Shelford, the Settlers' Arms, and that pub endured until the 1980s. I think it was pulled down to make way for a new bridge. And they make a very good living at Shelford through the 1840s. Really, that's the decade in which that kind of route to the west was opening up. And situated there at the inn, it became one of the stops on the way west, or somewhere that you stopped on the way back or forth from Hamilton to Geelong, which of course was really important already as a port, as a clearinghouse for wool, for the wealth of the Western District that those pastoralists created. And so the Ormonds collect all sorts of really good intelligence about where to go and what to do in the Western District in the 1840s, and Francis Ormond Sr. starts to acquire a bit of a hodgepodge, but a selection of pastoral properties that change very rapidly over the decade. They're held, some are held informally, and some are held with a £10 annual lease from the government, because you couldn't acquire freehold property very easily at that stage. That came later in the 1860s. By the late 1840s, young Francis, I think it's 1848, he was about 20 years old. He'd been doing the books at the Settlers' Arms. He was very bright. He was interested in making money and getting on. He went to manage a property, a large property on the Wodeyallup River, so south of Ballarat, for another pastoralist. And he was there for a few years, and then his father bought a very large property, 30,000 acres, And bought means he acquired the lease, but also any improvements that had been made to the land. This is 1851, just before the gold rushes. So he got in at a good time because property prices hadn't yet, they exploded basically after the influx of immigrants with the gold rushes. They acquire this property, Borealic, and he puts young Francis on as manager. Within about 3 years, so Francis is still in his 20s, he had bought out his father and had turned Borealic into the producer of the finest merino wool in Victoria, as it had become by that stage. And over the next 15 years, he built a pastoral empire. He improved, or in pastoralist terms, he improved the land. He built a grand bluestone mansion in the way they did. He got married, he became a magistrate, he was a member of the legislature. So he did all the things that were expected of an up-and-coming settler pastoralist. And later, in the 1870s, he continued to manage his pastoral. So he also acquired other properties, including mostly in the Western District, but some in southern New South Wales. In the 1870s, he and his first wife moved to Toorak, set up in a mansion, but he continued to manage all his pastoral affairs from there. And that's when he moves into philanthropy. And that's a well-known story. That's what you'll see if you look at the Australian Dictionary of Biography or you read one of the several biographical accounts. What that leaves out is whose land Francis Ormond made his fortune on, and it was the land of the Wadawurrung people, and how he went about that. The Ormonds were there in that first violent, explosive phase of settler colonialism. We know, haven't found evidence that either Francis Ormond was involved in direct violence towards the Wadawurrung people there, but it's quite likely, and they certainly would have known about it, and it was going on all around them. That was the environment in which they were establishing themselves and taking that land. They knew whose land it was. By the 1850s, when the gold rush starts, I said that the price of land went up and the value of cattle went up as well. So those pastoralists who were already established suddenly were able to sell their meat for a much higher price. But all their labourers ran off to the goldfields. And at that point, in the history of the Western District of Victoria, Aboriginal labour becomes really important for the pastoral economy. I think Australians tend to think of Aboriginal labourers as working on remote cattle stations in the north of the country and west, but Aboriginal labour was important in Victoria as well, especially in the 1850s. And we know that Francis Ormond employed Wadawurrung labourers, and we have his records of how much he paid them, and he made a point of saying that he did pay them, because obviously not all pastoralists did. We know from research that's been done that where Aboriginal workers were paid, it was usual that they were paid about half the rate of their non-Indigenous counterparts. Sometimes they were only paid in rations, and that their working conditions were inferior and discriminatory. We know, because Francis Ormond reported to the government, that there were about 40 Wadawurrung people living on Borealic or on Mount Emu Creek, because that ran along it and made it such a fine piece of land. And he said that they were from 3 distinct clans. He reported that people were dying. He said that they were dying from venereal disease, that they were dying following accidents when intoxicated. He said that the people that he knew were not supported by the government and probably should be, but he didn't actively do anything to help, or he didn't take on a role as a local guardian or honorary correspondent, which other pastoralists did. We know from his neighbour in 1852, who got very upset because he said, Francis Ormond has stolen my Aboriginal labourers. He didn't put it in those terms, those words. He said something much more offensive. But we know that, so it's very difficult so far to connect individual Wadawurrung people with Francis Ormond but we know that his whole pastoral economy relied on them at certain stages, and that his life was suffused with the fact that he was on Wadawurrung land. But that's been forgotten, and it's been avoided in the histories that have been written about that. Certainly not something that's recorded at Ormond College, or it certainly wasn't, maybe now, but it wasn't in the 1990s when I was a student there. So you see there that there's a public, celebrated kind of face of these people. And Ormond didn't only make those donations to the University of Melbourne, he also gave the money that founded the Working Men's College, which is RMIT today. He was very prominent in all sorts of educational fields, like with Presbyterian Ladies College. He gave money to asylums and to hospitals, and he was after the 1870s, in the 1880s, he was one of the most important philanthropists in Victoria, if not the most important for that decade of the 1880s. So he benefits not only from the wealth that he had made, but from the status that he accrued through his philanthropy. To give you a sense of that, when he died, he travelled to Europe several times, and he died in 1889, I think, in France. And his body was conveyed back to Victoria, and they had a very large and well-attended funeral in Scott's Church in the city, the Presbyterian Church. And then there was a procession, a funeral procession from the church to what was then Spencer Street Station, Southern Cross today, and a special train took the coffin to Geelong for it to be buried. Accompanied, kind of like, I don't think it was a state funeral, but that was the vibe, if you want. So he was an incredibly important person. Generations of people at this university have benefited from that legacy. And I lived in Ormond College as a student, and I'm a historian of this stuff. And until we started doing this project, I had very little idea about any of this. And it was a visceral shock to me to find out not just about Ormond, but about all these benefactors, and on whose land, and from whose labour they made those fortunes.
Thank you. Ross. Frank Tate.
He's a tricky one. Self-made man. Father was an itinerant sort of worker on the goldfields, an Englishman who came out. A good man who looked after the family. Frank worked his way up and became a student teacher. He was a very bright boy. Became a student teacher in one of the state schools. You didn't need qualifications. It was like an apprenticeship. This is pre the professional time of teaching, which he took a huge part in, which I'll explain. He worked his way up, brilliant reports. Without the notes before me, I can't remember exactly the order. He eventually became an inspector of schools. He took out a BA at Melbourne University, which was rare. There were scholarships available, and he would have been one of the earliest of these student teachers to take out a BA. He then subsequently took an MA. He was famous for reciting, whole plays of Shakespeare, so he obviously had a photographic memory. He was a bit of an activist. He was pushed for better conditions. He got involved in the first union. He pushed for better conditions, and he ended up, without going through it all, but he ended up being head of the Teachers' College, and then for a short time, and then there was a big Royal Commission, the Fink Royal Commission into education in Victoria, which was started by agitations by Simon the Age newspaper because of the payment by results system where teachers were paid depending on how well their children did in tests, and they were underpaid, and it was a pretty shambolic system. This was the state system that had been set up in 1870. The private school system was run completely differently. So this was for poor kids, and they were required to go. Mostly they went a bit. I've done some research on that. But then decided he was going to radically overhaul education in the state, and he got involved in a number of conferences. He became friendly with Richard Berry, who was dynamic, and they set up a big conference in, I can't remember, around about the First World War, to talk about education in Victoria. Now, just jumping back, because of the Fink Royal Commission, they decided to set up the first Director of Education, and he was appointed. So he was only a few years in the job at the Teachers College, which was on the university grounds and was de facto part of the university. It wasn't the education faculty, but it was, and they mixed together and a lot of things were done together. So anyway, he became the first, he impressed in front of the Fink Commission, even though he was a young man and he was telling them that the whole system was rotten. He showed up a lot of the senior people and they appointed him the first Director of Education. He then went on this project with Richard Berry to reform education in the state. And his big push was for secondary school for working class kids. And he got money, went to the UK, he saw schools there, the secondary moderns they were setting up. He came back, he went to the US, went lots of trips and finding out on information about how to set up a system. Eventually got an act passed, it was 1910, I think. It's around about there, 1910, there was an act passed which set up secondary education against huge amount of opposition from the conservative newspapers and from the private schools to set up secondary education. And they set up, it's quite a long story, it took about 20 years to get set up, but it set up those first high schools. So the one I went to, Bendigo High School, I think was set up in the 1920s or 30s, was one of the later ones. But they set up the high schools because the private schools had complained so much, they didn't set any up in the eastern suburbs. So all those old western suburb high schools, which are now secondary colleges, were set up under this act. But mainly a lot of tech schools and agricultural schools. And the tech schools, they spent a lot more money on tech schools. And this is the sort of nub, that Berry was now in public lecturing about head size to packed theatres, being introduced by the Minister for Education. And Frank Tate was the chair of the meeting. Berry was putting up his slides of head sizes, showing that private school kids had bigger head skull sizes than state school kids, and that academics had bigger skull sizes than teachers. And down the bottom were Indigenous Australians, of course, and around about them were the mentally deficient. And he had Ned Kelly's skull down as a 14-year-old boy, which proved that that was why he was a criminal. So the point that at the end of this was that criminals, most of the people in Pentridge were mentally deficient. There are a whole lot of mentally deficient people out there in the slums and suburbs, and they were there. This is very early time for genetics. There's a bit of genetics going on, and he knew about it, but it's an earlier, old form of science really that became discredited in Europe, even while Berry was still going on about it. He then sort of half-heartedly put genetics in a bit later. So he was saying things like they're genetically inferior, but he wasn't a geneticist at all. The first geneticist in the university was Wilfred Agar, who came in 1919, who was became a friend of Berry's. He was the first president of the Eugenics Society. I've mentioned him earlier. And remember, the universities, of course, were very small places then, so there was a lot of connections. So he's going around, he's on all the educational bodies with Berry. They're on the committees that advised the government about the Mental Deficiency Acts. There were 3 of them in 1921, 1928, 1939. Berry had gone by the 1939 one. That they wanted to set up institutions, so institutions for the mentally defective children, so they sent them up in Bell Street, Fitzroy. The one at Travancore is a later version of the schools for kids with disabilities, go back to this act as well, because they set up these schools at the same time. And so the whole system was set up really basically to stop working class kids. There were scholarships, and they said there will be a few kids down there that are bright. So they set up scholarships, but they fought tooth and nail to stop the university becoming fee-less, and it was incorporated in the University Act in the 1920s. So at a time when other universities around the world were opening up, Melbourne closed down, and it offered a series of scholarships, and that didn't really open up, I think, until about the 1950s, but James knows quite a bit about this, so you might correct me, I might be wrong, but certainly in the 1920s, Berry and Tate got this act passed. And it was, so Tate was involved in setting up this system to educate a lot more people, to give them a much greater education. He was a progressive. He was an old man when they set up the Eugenics Society. He said, I'd love to be a member, but I can't get to meetings, so he paid a small fee. He wrote to Agar and said, you're the best person to run this society. Agar was pro-sterilisation. He supported Ken Cunningham's career. Ken Cunningham was a person who did a doctorate in London with a eugenicist, a famous eugenicist. He came back to Melbourne. He went to Columbia, sorry. It was McCrae. He went to Columbia and worked on eugenics. Ken Cunningham became the first head of the Australian Council of Education, which is still going today, ACER. He was one of Tate's offsiders and proteges. Tate was on all the committees for the Mental Deficiency Acts. He was in the early Eugenics Society. He created a system. All the lectures Berry gave, mostly Tate was the chairman. He set up a system that actively discriminated against working class children, and that means after the 1880 Acts, Indigenous kids, because most of them were chucked into society and disappeared, they weren't recognised. So when Frank Tate went to the United States, it's in his correspondence, he went to a coloured school. I apologise for the offensive terms, but I think the audience understands what I mean. And what he said, one of the boys asked me, what was I doing for the Aboriginal children in Australia? He said, I was floored. I was shocked. And that's the end of the letter. Nothing. So he's been painted as a progressive, and a great figure in the university, which he was. But his progressivism was completely aligned with this sort of scientific idea that there was a hierarchy of people. It was in some way predetermined. There were possibilities for movement, but very little. So that's the dilemma you have with Frank Tate. Great educational reformer, a eugenicist.
Thank you. I want to move now perhaps to another ambivalent figure, former Prime Minister Alfred Deakin, and interesting figure because one of the things he's remembered for, at least in Indigenous studies, is being somewhat of a friend to William Barrack and the people of Corranderk. But on the other hand, once Federation happens and he becomes Prime Minister, he's one of the great architects of the White Australia policy and enshrining racism in the way the country operates and the government operates. So I'm just wondering whether people can tell me a little bit about Alfred Deakin.
Do you, James, or do you want me to? Or?
Well, I'll
start by saying that the first Eugenics Society in Victoria was the Eugenics Education Society. There is almost no record of it. There's one article in the Argus newspaper, and there are some papers at UCL that talk about it, University College London, letters about it. On the list, you've got, there's a small list that says a society was set up today. The president is Sir Walter Baldwin Spencer. He wasn't. He actually wrote a letter saying he was too busy to do it, but I found that letter later. And the members were the Honourable Alfred Deakin, So he was one of the first people to turn up to the first Eugenics Society in Victoria. That was in 1914, and it occurred in August 1914. The war broke out 2 weeks later, and in the correspondence I read from other people, they said it just folded because everyone was too busy running the war.
So Deakin's associated with the university because he's a student here. Doesn't graduate, but he's a student. There's a court named after him in the university as well. I think he illustrates the kind of double-edged character of so many of what we're talking about here as well, in that he's a progressive, but as bound up in the idea of progressivism in the early decades of the 20th century is this racial component. And
strong racial opponent. It's Australian progressivism is racist, and I know it's been written about before by lots of writers, but in some ways, in its institutionalised form, say in names in universities, it hasn't been recognised. This problem. Sorry, James.
Oh, absolutely. But all these, I mean, Tate, Cunningham, all these figures are all progressives, and so when we understand that, I think we need a more complex view. And likewise with Ormond, he is giving money to support all sorts of things he thinks is civilising Victoria, and yet that also has a racial component. I've not answered your question, but I think I just to try and connect some of these ideas, that when you have the sort of 19th century idea of civilising Victoria, the university is a really important linchpin in that, and it does have a racial component, and it does have quite a deleterious effect on Indigenous people, because it's not only about responding to a climate of ideas and applying these ideas in your work as the university. It's about shaping them. And universities are leaders in society, and so they are also defining what we mean by civilization. They are embracing these kind of racial structures within their arguments about progress or civilization or so forth.
I think that's true. I think they're also quite anxious about it. I mean, I think they're stuck out here in Melbourne. It's a long way from where they believe the centre of civilisation to be, which is Europe, Britain in particular, perhaps.
The home counties.
And so it's a very anxious settler colonial type of aspiring to civilisation that we see. And I think that's important to remember as well. So a lot of what Ross and James have been talking about with the eugenics that comes later, of course there's all these racial hierarchies are operating and being established in the 19th century as well, that it's partly a reaction to the uncertain position that these colonisers find themselves in. And that, I think, Ross helps explain why it takes a different form in Australia and the United States to what it does in Britain, where they feel themselves by that stage being more removed from, the crimes of settler colonialism, really.
A good example of that, which is the Catholic Church, which briefly, well, I've been through all their archives. Mannix had a bonfire, of course, and burnt all his papers, but I've been through the records. They knew about the Eugenics Society trying to influence the bills to sterilise people, and the Catholic Church were violently against sterilising and generally were violently against eugenics around the world, one of the few organisations that were consistently against it. But their attitude was, and if you read the Catholic bulletins, was white Australia is really important. So they attack Agar in articles and everything, but they don't do anything. They sort of don't like eugenics, but white Australia is really important for them. That's more important, and that's very Australian.
Are there any other figures in the university's history you'd like to reference?
Are we doing a series, are we?
Well,
I'd like to talk about Wilson, if we've got time. Samuel Wilson.
Do we have time? I think we can dedicate some time to Samuel Wilson.
Well, I talked about Samuel Wilson earlier, but he's another of these 19th century figures whose name endures, and yet I think almost nobody today, perhaps outside this room, thinks about who he was. He is the Samuel Wilson who gives £30,000 to build Wilson Hall in the early 1870s when the university can't find the money from government or any other source. But he was also one of the very richest people in Australia, and he owned the largest flock of sheep in the world, it was thought. And he had made his fortune first in the Wimmera and then at Ercildoune in northwest of Ballarat and Lake Burrumbeet, all on the back of, it was Indigenous land, Watchabollock land and then Wadawurrung land that he had taken. And he had also employed Aboriginal labourers at probably discriminatory rates. And he benefits from that so profoundly, and yet that is missing. And Wilson is one of the people, he's a kind of connection perhaps between things I've been talking about in the 19th century and some of these ideas about who Australia is for, who Melbourne is for, who the university is for. Because Wilson, by the time that Wilson Hall is built and it's finished in the late 1870s, he speaks not about the Aboriginal people that he had dispossessed, although he was very conscious of that. He speaks about the kind of ungrateful working classes of Australia. You know, he's more concerned about the people who'd won the 8-hour day, I guess, the people who'd sought to break up the big pastoral estates through the Selection Acts. But that was all of a piece. You know, the world was there for these men to take. They thought it was just for them. And I've got some remarks here from Wilson about his understanding of, you know, he acknowledged that the Aboriginal people of Victoria were the original owners of this land, but it didn't cause him a moment's concern. I might read you just a piece that I've got from Samuel Wilson. So this is 1869, and he was an honorary correspondent of the Central Board that protected Aborigines, protected with big quotes around it in that period. It's an era when the government was trying to move Aboriginal people off the land and onto reserves and missions, and it's the start really of that process of interfering in Aboriginal Victorians' lives. So trying to say where you could work, who you could work for, you had to have a permit, who you could marry, where you might live, what was going to happen to your children, which we know intensifies and becomes more and more strident through into the early 20th century. But this was starting in the 1860s. And Wilson distributed rations, basic clothing, to the Aboriginal people who lived on Longrenong Station in the Wimmera. And, you know, he distributed those rations through the 1860s. In mid-1860s, they'd spent about £120 a year to support the Aboriginal people who lived on Longrenong. By the end of the decade, it was more like about £70 a year. That's the moment when he gives £30,000 to the university to build a hall of suitable dignity. And it's the moment where he spends £236,000 to buy Ercildoune and, you know, continue his kind of climb to be the most important and magnificent man in Victoria, is knighted. So in 1869, he he reports on the Aborigines at Longrenong, and this is what he says. On the whole, I cannot see any prospect of improvement in their condition. They seem to be a doomed race. In no instance, in my experience, have they been badly treated by Europeans, and still they are silently disappearing from the lands that once had no other owner. If we can't prevent this, the least we should do in taking possession of their country is to make their declining years as comfortable as their habits will allow. Now that comes from one of the most important and richest men in Victoria. It's very characteristic of the age, the idea that there was this natural decline.
The doomed race theory.
The doomed race theory, but also an acknowledgement, a kind of passive acknowledgement, that it was their land.
It was their land, yeah.
And how I'd taken it, but a disconnect between that and the consequences of it. There's one of the stories that emerged from this project was about, that's Wilson talking about the Wimmera. When he moved to Ercildoune, there were far fewer Aboriginal labourers in the Ballarat kind of region at that state. There were more Aboriginal workers in the Wimmera by the 1870s than there were around Ballarat. But there was one Wadawurrung man called Mullawalla who lived on and around Ercildoune and who we know Wilson came into contact with, if it was rather superficial, because Mullawalla was also known as William Wilson, and he was also known as, I think he was called King Billy of Ercildoune. So Ercildoune, after the pastoral property named for a Scottish location, Wilson named for the landlord, if you like. But the irony, of course, is that this was Mullawalla's land. And he died, Mullawalla died in 1896, by which stage Wilson had returned to Britain. But we can trace his life, his later life, through newspaper reports that in the 1880s and 1890s that record him as a kind of curiosity. He was someone who was introduced to visiting nobility, to the governor when he visited Samuel Wilson's estate. He got in trouble with the law for being drunk. He was incarcerated. He was locked up for a couple of weeks in 1895 for breaking into a house, even though he was trying to escape larrikins, as they were described, near Lake Wendouree, who were throwing rocks at him. And when he died, he had an obituary that ran to 700 words in the Age. And he wasn't just a figure of local interest. These stories were syndicated around the Australian press, so they appear in the Kalgoorlie Express or whatever it was, on each occasion. And there's this sense that he's this tragic figure, but also to a degree a figure of kind of curiosity, almost of fun. He's been called King Billy, the last of his tribe, very common tropes for that period in Australia. And nobody really thinks or chooses to see beyond that kind of superficial level. There's no acknowledgement of what had been taken from him. It's portrayed as natural. And it fits in, I think, with what Ross and James are finding about those eugenicists, that it's a way of explaining what was essentially a grotesque crime, the theft of land, the making of fortunes from it, the endowment of this university and many other institutions, whilst it's a way of holding that without properly acknowledging it.
I think we're being told that we're running out of time. So to very quickly end our discussion, reconciliation is about action. And I guess to what extent is truth-telling an action that is necessary to reconciliation?
Well, I think it's essential. I mean, historians sometimes recoil from the idea of truth in their work, but I think it's a call to arms. I think it's a call to try and get as close to that as you can, to really tell the full story, rather than to try and fall back on niceties and to limit yourself by. So it's about trying to present a robust view, but one that connects the university with its people. The university isn't separated from the pastoral economy. It's not separated from the climate of ideas and the different things. These are part of what the university is doing. And I think if we can grasp that, we come away with a much richer and stronger, actually, more complete view of what a university is, its place in the world, that will inform us going forward. And also, really importantly, serves an act of kind of restitution, acknowledgement, reconciliation with its Indigenous students who come to this university with a completely different view of what some of these great and the good are. They look upon them not as, they wonder why. Why is the university celebrating some of these figures when we know a different side to what's happening? I think that we all need to know this and really, really take it on. So you're going.
I think that this is a start, but it's only a start. I think we tell some histories much more frequently and in much more detail than we tell others. And we need to, the work I've done on the pastoral economy and those benefactors and how that money was made, that's a history that's not that hard to locate, actually, but it hasn't been located, it hasn't been discussed, it hasn't been, we haven't gone out and spoken to the descendants of those people who were dispossessed, the Wadawurrung, the Wotjobaluk, the Jabwurrung further west, and ask them what they would like to do with this history. And I think that's something that needs to follow. It needs to be more than just, we need to tell the truth, but we need to do more than that as well.
Thank you. Ross?
When I was asked to do this project, I said I felt I was a bit uneasy about being an old white man, being the lead editor. I mean, I'm not writing the whole thing, and there are many more important, but as being the lead editor of the project. And Richard James said to me, why should Indigenous Australians apologise for the way old white men and young white men have behaved in the past? You're the old white man that's going to apologise. Now it's time for the Indigenous people in the university to take over.
Thank you, panel. That was a really thoughtful, insightful, and in many ways disturbing discussion. And as someone who is normally described as Indigenous, the discussion today has really prompted me to think about how each and every one of us is implicated in this history. I think it was Zoe who mentioned the Wodi Yallock Creek down in Western Victoria, and unsurprisingly I have an Indigenous and an Anglo ancestry, and one of my ancestors was a miner on that creek and kept British bulldogs to keep Chinese miners off his claim. And the family, of course, it almost goes without saying, denied Wadawurrung ownership and possession. And the farm which I spent lots of my childhood on was called Primrose Hill, which says something about the extent to which all of us, perhaps in Victoria, have denied the histories of settler colonialism and race. So I'd just like to thank each and every one of you for the discussion today, and look forward to seeing how this truth-telling exercise, when it's concluded, can really feed into renewed activity around reconciliation. Thank you.